Fine. So introduction to Oracle Listener. Whenever there is a new connection to database, the connection first lands onto Oracle Listener. Now what is this listener? Listener can be compared to or can be said like human ear to Oracle database. Listener is nothing but an ear which will be listening to all the incoming connections, and once the connections land onto listener responsibility is to hand over those connections to the database. So it is kind of a gatekeeper which will check the authentication and all the credentials are provided by the incoming connection, and it will take all those credentials and give it to the database. Now the Oracle listener is not dependent on Oracle database, which means Oracle Listener runs separately and database runs separately. There is no relation between your database being up and your listener being up. They can work independently. If your database is up, your listener can be down, or your listener is up, your database can be down. There is no relation between both of them. Only when the database service is registered with the listener will be able to handle the incoming connections for the particular database. So let us understand more in detail about Oracle Listener. First of all, how database connection happen in a normal Oracle database. So all the incoming connections land onto Oracle Listener. It's a separate process that runs on a database server. It's a totally different process. It is not included into your database process. Listener must be up for new connections. Your listener comes into effect only when you have new connections, which means if you have 1,000 connections to your database, which are currently connected to the DB, and your listener goes down, still those sessions will continue to work because listener will come into picture only for the new connections. Whenever a new connection is coming to the database, if listener is down, only the connection won't be able to complete to connect to the database. And that's why even if your listener is down and previously there are 1,000 connections, there won't be any impact on those connections. So even in real time, if you ever want to bounce the listener, you can anytime do it because it won't impact the existing connections. Only for the fraction of seconds when the listener is down, if there is any new connection, it will be terminated. Next is listener configuration file. So the listener configuration file resides under Oracle Home Network Admin location, and the listener configuration file name is listener.ora. This file will contain all the parameters required to run the listener process. Listener will take all the credentials which are incoming from a new connection and hands it over to PMON process. This is an interview question which is the background process in a database which handles the new incoming connections. It is PMON. Next is single listener can handle connections for multiple databases. You can have only one single listener configured where multiple databases connections can be taken by one listener and then connected to the database. Let us look at this option. On a single big server, we have multiple databases. Let's take, we have ProdDB, we have TestDB, we have DevDB, we have QADB. So the configuration that we can have over here is we can have only one listener, and this listener will handle the services of all the incoming connections for all the 4 databases. So only one listener to accept all the incoming connections for all the 4 databases on the particular server. This is one configuration. You have only one single listener. Next is you can configure multiple listener for single database for load balancing. Also, alternatively, what you can do is for a one single database, you can configure multiple listeners, which means let's take this is one listener for your ProdDB. What you can do, you can configure one more listener. So the connections can be pushed to this listener and This listener will again accept the connections for prod DB. This is kind of load balancing at listener level or incoming connections level. You can definitely have this configuration. Next, you can configure multiple listeners for multiple databases. Now, in this option, let us consider our previous example where we have only one single listener for all the databases. Now remember, in this case, let us assume there is one activity on prod DB. You want to bring down the prod DB, or you want that there should not be any new connections to the prod DB. So what you need to do, you need to bring down the listener. Now if you bring down the only listener on the server, even the connections to the other databases won't be possible. So that's why generally it is suggested to go with individual listener for individual databases. So in listener configuration, what you can do, you can have multiple listeners, like 4 listeners configured for all the 4 databases, and they handle the connection for respective databases separately. In this scenario, even if you want to bring down any one listener, it won't impact the connections to the other databases. The next thing is working with Oracle Listener. First thing, we must know how to check if listener is already running or not. ps-ef grep tns will give you the details about if listener is already up and running or not. But this only gives the listener process is running at OS level or not, but this does not guarantee which database connection the listener will handle. Next is command to connect to listener utility. As we know that listener is altogether a completely different utility, and it's a different process which will handle the connections. The utility name is lsnrctl. So once you type lsnrctl, it will enter into listener utility, or lsnrctl is nothing but listener control utility. Next is the checking of the listener configuration file. Again, the same configuration file resides under network admin, and listener.ora is the file name. Let us try to connect to our machine on 92.168.0.171. Okay, 16. We'll log in as root user. Okay, switch to Oracle. Let us check if any database is already up and running. Okay, ProdDB is up and running. Okay, fine. What we'll do is we'll first check at OS level if any listener process is running. ps-ef grep pmon. Okay, sorry, this is database process ps-ef grep tns. So no listener is running right now. TNS, yeah. No listener at OS level is running, so which means there is no listener configured for ProdDB. Right. Next is Oracle Listener configuration. When you try to configure Oracle Listener, remember there are two types of configuration. One is manual configuration and the other one is NetMGR utility. There is another one more utility, NetCA, Network Configuration Assistant. But I personally suggest, if you really want to go for listener configuration or TNS entry configuration, always go with NetMGR, because in the Net Manager you have more options than NetCA. In the manual method, what you do is you edit the listener configuration file manually, you put in all the required details, and you start and stop the listener. So the recommendation is on manual method. Why? Because in real time you do not get the GUI interface so easily. In that case, if you are good at manual configuration, it makes your life easy and you get to know the in-depth details of how Oracle Net connectivity happens. So the sample listener configuration file entry is below. First of all, the name of the listener, and we need to give the details where the listener will be running, the host name, and which port number. So the host name would definitely be the same host where you want to accept the connections or where the listener is running. Next is we need to give the list of SIDs that this particular listener, the name of the listener right now is listener only. So if you change the listener name like listener 1, over here also you need to change listener 1, which means below are the SID list which are handled by listener 1. In current scenario, the SID DB SID, this is the service or this is the SID which is being handled by listener, or listener is our default listener name. Remember, in Oracle, whenever you create a listener or whenever you try to create a listener via netca or netmgr, the default name of listener will be listener only. If you are manually editing the entry, then you need to change listener name over here on the top, and you also need to give the same listener name over here. So let us try to practice the listener configuration for our ProdDB database. Perfect. So the sample listener.ora configuration file. First of all, we need to open this file, nothing but our configuration file which resides under network admin listener.ora. Just open this file, vi, and get into insert mode. Now this is the listener name. We are also going with the default listener name, and we have the host name as our host IP address. This is our IP address of the remote machine 192.168.0.171, and the listener would be working on default port number 1521. In case if you change the port number, remember you have to mention the same in the client connections. Next is SID list for the listener name listener. So I repeat, below is the SID list which will be supported by the listener, and the name of the listener is listener. So in case if you change the listener underscore, let's take host. So over here also you have to give the same listener name as host, which means below are the SID which is supported by listener host. So right now what we'll do is we'll go with the default listener configuration with the name as listener. And in SID list you need to mention what is the database SID for which this particular listener will accept the connections, and what is the Oracle home for this particular DB. So let us copy paste these details. Right. Save the listener configuration file. Great. Next is we need to start the listener because we just now configured the listener configuration file. We need to make sure the background listener process is started so that it can accept the incoming connections. First of all, get inside listener control utility by just typing lsnrctl. So the listener control utility allows you two methods to play around with listener. You can give the start, stop commands at the command line itself along with lsnrctl, or else you can get inside lsnrctl control utility by just typing lsnrctl, and it will always defaultly take the default listener name as listener. So the current listener that it is connected to is listener. Perfect. To start the listener, or first of all let us check the status. Now it's saying no listener is running currently. What we will do is we'll start the listener. Just type start, enter. Now what we can see is listener parameter file is nothing but our own listener configuration file. Listener log file is the location where all the listener related errors or listener related connection details will be placed into this log file. Next is where your listener is listening. It is nothing but the same host name and the 1521 default port number. Services summary. Now services summary, as we know, one listener can have multiple services and each service will handle the incoming connection for a particular database. Currently we have only one service, that is ProdDB, and it has only one instances, right? Because we have only one ProdDB instance, so that's why we have only one service which is associated with one instance, that is ProdDB. Next is instance prod.db status unknown. Always remember, for the first time when your listener registers, when your database registers with your listener, that time the status will be unknown until there is one connection inside the database. So right now there is no connection inside the database through this listener, so that's why it will show as unknown, and has one handlers for this service. One handler because we have one service for ProdDB connection. Perfect. We'll just exit from LSNRCTL utility and check the process at OS level ps-ef grep tns. Now we can see that our listener background process is showing up over here, which means ps-ef grep tns is giving correct output. So by this output you can definitely tell listener is running, but you can never tell which service it is supporting. Now to stop the listener, the same command, you just get inside the lsnrctl utility, just type stop. So this will stop your listener status. There's no listener. Let us start the listener, start and exit. Perfect. This is about configuring listener in normal database environment. Now let us assume you want to handle multiple SIDs into one listener. We will look at that example after the Oracle client configuration, where we will understand how to configure multiple services in one listener